morning. Thank you all so much for coming out on a Saturday morning. We are all presenting papers here without a chair or commentator, so we're sort of timing ourselves and introducing ourselves. So I'll just get things started here. My name is Rebecca Davis. I'm an associate professor of history at the University of Delaware, where I have a joint appointment in Women and Gender Studies. I have a book called More Perfect Unions, The American Search for Marital Bliss, which is a history of marriage counseling and guidance in the United States since the 1930s, and effectively is a history of heterosexual norms, of heteronormativity, and the sort of organizational efforts to define and sustain it through the 20th century. And I've published chapters and articles that look at the intersections of religion and sexuality in the 20th century United States. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here, and this is my first time as a historian where I've had subjects of my work present on the panel and in the audience, people that I've long read and admired. So I am presenting work today that is a work in progress, and I'm extremely excited for feedback. These are ideas I'm working through. I don't present this as sort of the last word on the topic at all, but something I'd really like to open up for discussion if there's time toward the end. Heterosexuality is right and follows naturally. If father and mother are well adjusted and love each other, the child will catch the spirit of it. So that's a quotation from Dr. Roy A. Burkhart, who was the minister of a community church in Columbus, Ohio. And it's from a premarital counseling pamphlet that he authored. It's undated, probably late 1940s or early 1950s. So let's think about what Burkhart said about heterosexuality. He described it as something that was simultaneously right, natural, but also, it would seem, teachable. He explained that children would learn from their parents to be heterosexual and thus have happy marriages when they became adults. So for Burkhart and for many other post-war marriage counselors, because his views were not outside of the realm of the average, heterosexuality was natural, but it was not innate. It was morally right, but it was not intuitive. I mentioned Burkhart and post-war World War II marriage counseling because I want to understand how and why the idea of heterosexuality as a distinct category of identity, explicitly and implicitly opposed to a homosexual identity, emerged in the mid-20th century. How these two identities shaped one another as they were defined. But then, of course, how the women's liberation movement, in its responses to marriage counselors, psychology, social science that were so central to a lot of the work that feminists did, how the women's liberation movement revolutionized the way we discuss and understand sexual desires and identities. In my book and articles, I describe heterosexuality as something that was very self-consciously constructed. It's particularly between the 30s and the 50s, you see marriage counselors sort of unself-consciously talking about we need to teach people how to be heterosexual. The idea that it was this implicit standard against which to measure wasn't quite yet established. And it was something that needed preparation and practice in order to be sustained. Currently, I'm writing an article, sort of a review piece, about how historians have written the history of heterosexuality. There have been some wonderful review essays recently in the field about the history of lesbian identity. There have been some wonderful pieces on the way historians write about male homosexuality. I'm really interested in how historians write the history of heterosexuality. And so my presentation today is trying to figure out, well, where does the women's liberation movement fit within that conversation? So here are some questions I'd like to figure out how to answer. What did the women's liberation movement of the late 1960s and early 1970s contribute to the history of heterosexuality? How did feminists define it? And how did they define heteronormativity as something distinct from it? They often use the word heterosexuality both to discuss different sex desires and to discuss the sort of superstructure, the institutions that established norms. To what extent did radical feminists discuss heterosexuality and homosexuality as categories of identity? and to what extent did they discuss them as cultural constructs? Finally, how did Black and Third World feminists challenge or shape differently those categories and definitions? By putting discussions of feminists about heterosexuality into this historical context, I think we can see that feminists initiated a really new conversation about the origins and implications of what we today call heteronormativity. The conversation was new, I argue, and this is what I want to test out, in part because heteronormativity was new. When feminists questioned the inevitability of heterosexual and homosexual identities, they challenged a sexual binary that had only first emerged in the early 20th century and had only been really consolidated in the 1940s and 50s. Heteronormativity, moreover, was a deeply race and class-specific idea. That piece of it is something I'm not going to talk about that much for the next 10 minutes, but I'd be happy to return to it later. But it's very important to, I think, this whole story. So in my paper today, it has two major parts, both of which are very quick. But to first briefly summarize this longer history of heterosexuality, and second, to very briefly summarize where I think the women's liberation movement contributed to that history. So first, this history of heterosexuality. I'm going to talk about three broad historical periods leading up to the women's liberation movement. The first of those periods is sort of the 18th, 19th century, where understandings of different sex eros, sort of different sex desire, were within a very clearly hierarchical, patriarchal framework. It was understood by law and by custom that husbands owned the bodies of their wives and other dependents. And the whole idea of different sex intimacy was tied to a whole variety of social, economic, and political relationships. But it was also the case that different sex eros, different sex desire, could very easily coexist even within marriages with same-sex desires. So we have plenty of archival evidence of women who before and sometimes even during their marriages to men sustained deeply intimate and often sexual relationships with other women. We have letters from men who during the Civil War had romantic partnerships with other soldiers, and then after the war married and continued to write letters to "my dear wife." And their wives would write postscripts to these men at the ends of the letters, right? So that wives and husbands were aware that sexual desire could flow in a variety of different directions, and it wasn't inconsistent with being married to someone of a different sex. There were also, though, especially by the mid to late 19th century, the beginnings of a critique of heterosexuality as an institution, primarily through sex radical circles and in the temperance movement, where you start to see the figure of the violent drunk husband. I mean, the word alcoholic wasn't really around, but the drunk who would go to the saloon after work and come home and physically abuse his wife and children. Particularly within sex radical publications, without calling it sexual abuse, there was the beginning of a conversation that there was something that because these women couldn't divorce, because the sort of organization of heterosexuality was as it existed in this patriarchal system, that heterosexuality could in fact be a very dangerous arrangement. Okay, that's the first period. The second historical epic for this really is the 1880s through the 1920s, sort of our transition to a more modern understanding of sexuality. This is when sexology, psychiatry, and psychology start to talk about perversions. And we don't have a sexual binary. We have a profusion of all kinds of perversions, heterosexuality among them. Heterosexuality is coined as a term to describe this sort of bizarrely exclusive sexual interest in someone of a different sex. And that's where it originates as a term. But they're beginning to try to create sort of a taxonomy of sexual desires through this pathologizing impulse of social scientists and physicians and psychiatrists. At the same time, queer alternatives are quite visible, and various sort of subcultures of queer desire and expression are easy to be found. We see by the end of this period the beginning of the creation of explicitly homosexual persons, right? People beginning to call themselves as such, to organize communities as such. And also at the same time, in the burgeoning sort of leisure culture, commercial culture, an emphasis on heterosocial activities. So young people are increasingly encouraged to socialize with members of different sex, and that has become increasingly normalized. By the 1930s to 1960s, the third of these periods, we see the real emergence of the heterosexual person, right? And the consolidation of homosexual and heterosexual norms. Moreover, it's during this period of the 30s to the 60s that new professions are invented or expanded to help people consolidate and reinforce those identities. During these decades, we see the suppression of queer communities and desires, the lavender scare, purges of the federal government, and new efforts to screen homosexuals out of the military. And we see also during this period a new emphasis on heterosexuality as an institution. So this is where I'm arguing this idea that heterosexuality is the norm under which sexual desire should be understood first emerges in a meaningful way. This heterosexual norm was increasingly raised as white through the stigmatization of assistance, of public assistance, and single motherhood. And we see an increasing efforts to police the sexuality of women as part of this new impulse. So I'm going to now move into my discussion about the women's liberation movement and what it contributed, but I wanted to present it against that backdrop. I'm going to move very quickly now because I have about 5 minutes. I want to talk about radical feminist, lesbian feminist, and black feminist responses. Now, I did a whole bunch of research, and I can talk about maybe 3 people or 3 ideas in all of this. So you'll forgive me for all the people I'm not going to mention and discuss. Radical feminists were among the first to sort of call out the Roy Burkharts and the marriage counselors and the psychologists and say, what you're describing is nonsense because you're talking about something being so natural and normal, yet you have expended an enormous amount of effort to make sure we all do it. So that doesn't really make sense. They also criticized the demonization of homosexuality as illness and focused on the way that patriarchy shaped heterosexual norms. And that's a theme that you see in radical feminist and lesbian feminist critiques, is that this idea that, if we could get rid of sexism, we probably wouldn't have this binary, right? That the binary itself is a product of patriarchy, a product of sexism. And so, of course, Anne Kate in The Myth of the Vaginal Orgasm talks about how women have been taught to understand their different sex desires from the viewpoint of what pleases men most during sexual intercourse. In Sexual Politics from 1970, Kate Millett described heterosexual intercourse as itself a learned behavior and had famously skewered the descriptions of heterosexual coitus in Henry Miller and D.H. Lawrence and Norman Mailer for the way in which their descriptions of sex were in fact just sort of iterations of their male chauvinism. She wrote, "So much is this the case that even the act of coitus itself is the product of a long series of learned responses." So completely trying to denaturalize understandings of heterosexuality. And of course, there were differences within the movement about whether a woman could be a feminist and be engaged in a relationship with someone of a different sex, with a man. And that was on the, Red Stockings, for an example, identified the problem as male supremacy, not necessarily men themselves. Men could also be liberated, while other radical feminists argued that that was literally sleeping with the enemy, that you needed to be away from men in order to further feminist revolution. And I have examples of that I'm just skipping over entirely. Artemis will be speaking about woman-identified women, so I'm not going to cover that in much detail, but it's important that lesbian feminists, through that document, contributed this idea of heterosexuality as a social construction, and the idea of homosexuality and heterosexuality as socially constructed categories. That the binary itself was something that originated out of patriarchy and that divided women's and divided people's desires according to male interests. Finally, make a quick point about black feminists, that their discussions about heteronormativity said we can't talk about this unless we're simultaneously talking about racism, and class-based discrimination. That heteronormativity is one of a multiplicity of intersecting identities. And I'll just add that a lot of the really inspiring scholarship on heterosexuality that I've been reading from the last 10 years has looked at, for example, rereading the Moynihan Report is not simply targeting African American women and condemning their lifestyles, but really homophobia in the Moynihan Report in the way that black men as sort of failed heterosexuals. So that if you were poor and single, you might be engaged in sexual relationships with people of a different sex, but you still couldn't fit within the hetero norm of privilege that was embraced more broadly. So, too much in too little time. I'll wrap up. I think within this longer historical framework, we can see that women's liberation was responding to assertions of heteronormativity that began in the early 20th century and really coalesced after World War II. For every social scientist, policymaker, and advice giver, that's my timer, who defined heterosexuality as a benevolent norm, feminists exposed the incoherencies and biases that pervaded their ideas. They reframed heteronormativity as damaging, dangerous, and repressive. And a point I skipped over earlier, I mean, radical feminists bring in this incredibly important debate about rape. And one thing I found when I wrote a book on the history of marriage counseling is I was reading case notes, and there are women, it's not like women hadn't been telling their marriage counselors that their husbands hit them or raped them. Marriage counselors just hadn't paid any attention to it. And it's really in the 70s, after women's liberation has been raising this issue, that finally the marriage counseling and therapy journals are publishing articles on domestic violence. Right? Oh wow, this is actually not just one woman's complaint, this is a systematic issue. The differences among feminists about how to define and critique heterosexuality point to some of the fundamental differences in theory and politics that pervaded the movement. In general, when feminists critiqued heterosexual hegemony and patriarchy, they engaged in acts of critical reinterpretation, exposing hidden scripts and their consequences. Thank you.
My name is Lieff. I am a blogger and activist historian, and most of my work, writing and activism, has focused on BDSM, feminism, and specifically about how the BDSM community has recently been dealing with rape culture and issues of assault and abuse within the kink community, and also just tips and strategies for members of that community, which I'm also a part of, on how to deal with this. I'm a recent graduate from the University of Massachusetts Amherst in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and I finished a thesis there last May on the history of how the BDSM community has discussed rape and assault within their community. So much of my talk today will be drawn from that work. What I'm focusing on today is basically how the acknowledged history of feminism discussions within BDSM relate to activism in 1970s women's lib, even though this is not necessarily frequently discussed or acknowledged. To the extent that the history of BDSM and feminism even gets discussed, which in and of itself it is a very rare topic to run across in an academic setting, it is often framed as mostly a third-wave phenomena that has cropped up recently, or at best a product of activism in the sex war debates. But BDSM feminist activism in the early 80s was largely shaped by the women's lib debates that directly preceded it around feminist sexual identity, and in turn the recent emergence of feminist BDSM practitioners examining rape culture within their own community is deeply referential to both 80s sex war activism and women's lib. So looking especially at the activism of feminist and queer women in the kink community, I've drawn connections between kink activism in the 80s onward and the activism of women's lib, which saw the foundations of organizing and theory around sexual violence and the debates around sexual politics that have set the groundwork for the rest of what I've studied. And This is, also in many ways a work in progress, and any feedback people have is greatly appreciated. I don't claim to have the last word. I think I'm just beginning to learn what the first word is, so I'm open. But prior to the 1970s, very few feminist resources around rape and sexual violence were available. Feminist activist groups in the 1970s began to change that. For example, in 1971, the New York radical feminists began hosting events about sexual violence. In January of that year, they held a speak out for roughly 300 people as an opportunity to share personal stories about sexual violence in the context of anti-rape activism, and later that year they held a conference on the same subject. It wasn't even until the next year, 1972, that the first rape crisis centers in cities like DC and Chicago were started. And in 1975, Susan Brown Miller, partially as a result of attending the NY Radical Feminist Conference on Rape and being deeply influenced by it, published one of the most influential and widely distributed books on rape to come out of women's lib, Against Our Will. Brown Miller's book was fastidiously researched in many ways in line with what we might now describe as an intersectional analysis of the problem of sexual violence, and invaluable to anti-rape activism. But it also, interestingly, contains some of the first formally published statements about how some in the organized feminist community felt about SM. In a section on the gay liberation movement, Brown Miller said that she didn't believe that SM was a civil libertarian right because she didn't believe one could consent to an SM scene, and even went on to wonder if there might be something uniquely pathological about homosexual male sadomasochistic desire. The 1970s also saw an increasing interest in defining an appropriate feminist sexuality and how that might manifest. Existing debates over lesbians' place within the women's movement, the discrimination they suffered there, lesbian separatism, and even the legitimacy of male homosexual behavior spoke to these questions in much the same way the later and more widely publicized debates over pornography and BDSM would. And feminist BDSM activists writing about their work clearly saw that in the context of women's lib. In an interview in 1981 discussing the fall of the sexual revolution of the late 60s, and a frustration of how sexuality debates were being handled among feminists, lesbian SM activist Gail Rubin said, "Women like me felt that it hadn't worked because it was male-dominated, but we still wanted it in a non-sexist way. Other women said it's male-dominated and it hasn't worked for women, so it won't, and we don't want anything to do with it." So basically, the women who don't want anything to do with the sexual revolution are now defining the discourse around sex. The fight to define the discourse around sex was, of course, of heightened concern to many feminist activists in the early 80s during the sex war debates. Feminists who argued that contentious issues such as BDSM, pornography, and prostitution were not inherently anti-feminist and did not, as many suggested by their nature, promote violence against women, saw their activism at least in part as a response to the culture of women's lib. Pat Califia, one of the founding members, along with Rubin, of the first lesbian SM organization, Samoa, said in an essay on that group's history that the women's environment of the 60s and 70s was a hostile place for sadomasochistic women. There was practically no discussion. Within feminist rhetoric, SM existed only as a metaphor for sexual inequality in a male-dominated society. And as a sexual minority, women who practiced SM, instead of just fantasizing about it, were ignored. Activists like Califia and Rubin, who struggled to assert a lesbian SM presence within the lesbian and feminist communities of the early 80s, were met with intense opposition. For anti-SM feminists in this period, liberation for women partially meant creating a world where interpersonal violence was wholly eliminated, and some feminists, especially in the lesbian community, were specifically opposed to the existence of groups like Samoa. Organizations like the NY Radical Feminists, who had influenced Brown Miller in the 70s, were now co-sponsoring anti-SM literature like the Women Against Pornography's Coalition for Feminist Sexuality and Against Sadomasochism leaflet that was distributed in the protest at the 1982 Barnard Conference. As they saw it, the idea that women would ritualize violence against each other and call it feminist directly worked against their labor to protect women from rape and domestic violence, despite the insistence of SM lesbians that their activities were sought out and consensual. It was in this context of having to constantly defend SM sexually as not anti-feminist that In a joint interview with Ruben and Lieff, they asked, what happens if an SM person does get assaulted, battered, or raped? What are these people going to say? Well, they say they wanted it. They are in a position of rationalizing violence against SM people. This is actually one of the first public acknowledgments from activists within the SM community of the distinction between outsiders' perception of SM as rape or violent and the potential for actual interpersonal violence within SM relationships. Ruben, who herself had been part of Women's Lib organizing while in college, had found herself in a position of now potentially feeling that other mainstream feminist activists were actually implicitly supporting violence against her community. And again, though the feminist sex war debates took on a life of their own and are often treated as a contained entity, activists were understanding them in context of the past decade. In an interview of Heresies in 1981, Lieff described a rift from mainstream organizations as an intense alienation that felt like being, quote, cut off from the matrix I used to become an adult. Activists working to defend SM saw this alienation as implicated in the destruction of all gay or queer communities and questioned why mainstream lesbians felt they could gain traction by distancing themselves from less normative sexualities. They argued that all marginalized sexual groups must defend and support each other, and that the identity-based splinterings of the past decade within women's and gay liberation movements only played into conservative attempts to repress sexuality. Now, looking beyond the sex wars, the influence of Women's Lib on feminist BDSM remains apparent, especially in present-day internet culture. But as early as the 1990s, the DV and rape crisis work that had began in 1970s feminist circles began to reach the BDSM community in a targeted way. Dozens of small leather and SM journals published warning lists about how to identify an abusive DS relationship and what community members could do to help support each other. And in a way that went beyond questions like, do they hit you, since for their constituents the answer was often going to be a very happy yes, and focused more on helping practitioners discern when their chosen boundaries or limits were being abused or disrespected in a way that made contextual sense to members of the DS community. Though it's now defunct, the National Leather Association created a group called SafeLink as a clearinghouse of information and resources for kinksters around the issues of SM and abuse. These resources and articles, for the most part, were cribbed from the basic anti-DV and rape crisis information that feminist activists began distributing in the 70s and 80s. And this laid the groundwork for an emergence of a robust feminist BDSM community within the past decade. The writers and activists in this community are in many ways the direct inheritors of kinky conversations in the online community of Usenet in the 90s, who in turn often came out of the sex war debates and Women's Lib. Some of these connections are more obvious than others. There now exists, for example, exactly one rape crisis center in the US, the Network All Red here in Boston, that explicitly expresses support and targeted services for members of the BDSM community among other sexual minorities. Although the idea of a rape crisis center that openly supported BDSM would likely have felt rather unthinkable at the advent of the first rape crisis centers and DV support organizations, the Network All Red is modeled very closely on a largely unchanged model of hotline crisis support and community trainings. And then there is the advent of an ever-growing online blogging community dedicated to exploring the relationship between feminism and BDSM. By the numbers, it represents somewhat of an explosion in this field. There are now big established names online, such as pseudonymously named activist Clarice Thorne, who publish ebooks and have highly trafficked blogs where they dedicate considerable energy to looking at BDSM through a feminist lens, and especially around the issue of rape culture, another idea that has its antecedents in 1970s anti-rape organizing. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of acolytes blogging and reblogging these folks' analysis to personal websites, Twitter, and Tumblr. To take people who post to the website Tumblr, which is a very popular website for users to reblog posts, pictures, and links that they like online, as an example of how online internet discourse around BDSM and feminism mirrors Women's Lib, I'll share with you what I found when I recently Googled BDSM feminist rape on the website Tumblr. One poster to Tumblr wrote about why they were never going to be a feminist. What had started out in their analysis as a critique of some feminist strong position against BDSM turned into an indictment of feminism generally. This is their direct quote. They said, they, being feminists, claim to be allies of the LGBT community but call transgender males gender traitors. They say that gay men are gay because the patriarchy has taught them to hate women so much they won't even sleep with them. They say transgender men are transgender because they want to go into women's bathroom and rape women. They also say straight women are gender traitors too. To most feminists, it's only okay to be a lesbian and everything else is bad. I couldn't find any trace on this person's page that their reference felt historical to them, which means that for this writer, the issues that were being contended with in the 1970s feminist debates are also issues that they feel most exposed to today. Of course, this isn't actually the most common analysis of feminism that you'll find online. In fact, it's rather rare. But everything that this poster pointed out, transphobia, heterophobia, even homophobia towards men, are things that can be found on hundreds of self-described feminist pages within the Tumblr universe, and therefore becomes a source of contentious debate for these bloggers. The emergence of a large group of bloggers on Tumblr who adhere to this brand of radical feminism has in fact led to an almost cyclical repeat of the defenses of BDSM first formulated by the founders of Samoa and other groups in the early 80s. One person posted in response to a long thread eviscerating BDSM as anti-feminist that I've spent years trying to feel okay in my own sexuality, and the fact that my sexual interests aren't fucked up or abnormal or don't belong with my feminism. If I'm in charge of what these acts mean to me, to my own body, then I don't believe I'm engaging in my own oppression. And they later wrote, I'm going to prioritize that real woman and her pleasure every time. Every woman having an orgasm is a feminist act. Women not having to justify the things that give them pleasure, provided no one else is harmed, is a subversive, wonderful feminist act. The echo of women's lib and sex work activism, even when writers aren't acknowledging it, is clear in the way that these feminist debates manifest on websites like Tumblr. In many ways, if you took these quotes out of their context, you wouldn't even necessarily be able to tell which decade they had been written in. And though these are not the only debates that exist in the BDSM feminist community, many are now focused on rape culture and how to combat it, and are being followed up by a recent increase in interest in how to bring an intersectional analysis to bear on the kink community. They are among the debates that predominate. It's not just on Tumblr, but on Twitter and on personal blogs and in actual BDSM communities that people are still rehashing these issues of whether or not BDSM is okay and whether or not feminism has a place for these practitioners. So in my view, looking from the 80s to present day at how BDSM feminist activists have done their writing and contributed to their communities, though the 1970s are not often brought into this picture, it seems that it's hard to fully understand the debates that are going on without them, and this is an issue that I hope to continue exploring more in the future. Thank you. Thank you.
On February 28th, 1970, 300 women, most of whom came from the New Haven community, gathered to listen to Kate Millett and Naomi Weinstein giving at the plenary of the Free Women Conference. Weinstein concluded her talk with an excerpt from a play that she and other women wrote in honor of the founding of the CW, the Chicago Women's Liberation Union. And the play ended with a litany about women's resistance throughout time across borders. And I'm going to read you a little bit of it. It ends with two witches saying, the audience says, who are you, who are you? And the witches say, I am with a woman bleeding to death on the kitchen table of a quack abortionist. I am with a woman answering endless questions of the inquisitive caseworkers. I am with the caseworkers whose dreams of making a new social order have been long smothered in the endless bureaucracy, the endless forms, the racism of her superiors. The litany continues. And where there are women too beaten down to fight, I will be there, and we will take strength together, everywhere. For we will have a new world, a just world, a world without oppression and degradation. The audience rose to its feet with loud applause, lasting several minutes. After everyone had resumed their seats, Rita Mae Brown rose from the audience, saying, "Why," she said accusingly, "do you not say, 'I am with the women who love other women'?" The audience gasped. But Weinstein diffused the atmosphere and said, "Sure, we will include that. We'll write it together." That evening, some of the women who had been at the conference gathered at a party at the house of a heterosexual couple, and they got themselves, according to one woman, into a little room and started talking about their gym coaches, the women they had crushes on in high school when we were 12 or 14. And all of a sudden, the man of the house came in and announced the party was over. So this story illustrates a process that is not unique to New Haven. Similar events took place throughout the country in the early 1970s. Despite their confrontational style, the radical lesbians, self-styled troubadours of lesbian feminism, found a receptive audience among women's liberation activists. And many women, exhilarated by the newfound sense of sisterhood and the transformation in their own lives, responded eagerly to the prospect of deepening their relationships with other women. Well, some historians of feminism, and I want to give Ms. Rosen credit here, talk about this process well. The common narrative about lesbians in the women's liberation movement in the historical literature, this is not so much true of the psychology and sociology literature, but in the historical literature, it emphasizes the coming out process of closeted lesbians and how they combated discrimination in the women's movement, and describes heterosexual women who became lesbians either as women who had previously repressed their lesbian desires or as political lesbians obeying a feminist mandate to eliminate men from their emotional and sexual lives. According to some accounts, one set of women were genuinely gay or expressing a compelling sexual inclination, while others embraced homosexuality more out of conviction than instinct. These are all quotes. It is these political lesbians who are often charged with desexualizing or sanitizing lesbianism in order to make it more acceptable. This dichotomy flattens the sexual experience of women's liberation activists and obscures the ways that women's liberation movement enabled participants to reshape their sexual desires. A rigid distinction between political and personal fails to recognize the ways that these realms were fused for women's liberation activists. The political and the erotic were not mutually exclusive categories. I've used some interviews with women in New Haven to examine the variety of ways that women who claimed a lesbian identity in the women's liberation movement experienced this process. And the coming out narrative, coming out of a closet, discovering, finally acknowledging, this describes some women's journey, but it doesn't describe everyone. And it functions to create a biographical cohesion for individuals and to generate bonds among lesbians that sometimes have frayed as differences surfaced. So coming out accurately describes the journey for some of the women. I'm going to talk about a couple. So for Joan, claiming a lesbian identity meant reclaiming and validating long-buried desires. She'd been in a relationship with a woman in high school and in college and had gone to therapy to try to deal with what she felt were shameful feelings. The personal discussions in her 1969 women's group, she reflected later, were very threatening to me because it was stirring up all these longings to be with women, and I felt that the more we got into women talking about men as the enemy and feeling sexually oppressed by men, the more I thought, if they knew I was a lesbian, they would hate me. I was totally freaked out. When women's liberation activists began talking about women loving women as an extension of feminist politics, Joan was able to reclaim her long repressed sexual feelings. I'm very glad that my coming out as an adult happened in a political context, she commented, because as a teenager being a lesbian was so scary and isolating and shameful, I just felt like I could never, never have come out again. If I hadn't had the political support, I would have been very frustrating. Christine Patti describes herself as head gay, as opposed to bed gay, because she had never had a relationship with another woman, but she talked about it and was very conscious of her lesbian desires, but she actually didn't talk about it because she shared Joan's feelings of isolation and fear and felt that feminists were often very defensive when they were accused of being lesbians, and she kept quiet about her own feelings until women's liberation started talking about love between women as an extension of women's liberation, which she said started a high that she's been on for many years. So these are two stories that are accurately described by the Come Out journey. But for other women, the journeys were different. Women's liberation activists challenged taboos and barriers and assumptions about what women could and couldn't do. Discussions within the movement illuminated for many women the limits that they had placed on their relationships with women, which were often more emotionally intimate than their relationships with men. In an environment that nurtured personal expression of their personal change and political change, some women found a joyful expansion of their sexual and emotional vocabularies. In New Haven, as elsewhere, heterosexual women activists developed relationships with each other in a discovery of new possibilities of sexual pleasure with other women. Instead of coming out, one might say that they came in to a community of support of lesbian relationships, or perhaps, as Arlene Stein suggests about lesbians in the 90s, developed in a process of becoming rather than coming out. Sandy Harris, for example, had several relationships with men, but was also attracted to women and was thinking and reading about lesbian relationships. She describes herself as someone who could have some amount of choice, and feminism encouraged me to make the choice to stay with women. When she first got involved with a woman, she remembered thinking, the sky is going to fall. But when she first kissed her, but it just felt nice. It just felt nice, but it also did feel like I had to make a conscious switch to change my sense of what was attractive to women rather than men. Taking their relationships with each other seriously in defiance of cultural norms, women gave themselves permission to see each other as lovers. When I allowed myself to fantasize, recalled Jennifer Abbott, it seemed possible to love another woman. Increasingly, numbers of women in women's liberation were turning these fantasies into reality. Rhea Hirschman, for example, had been bored by her relationships with men. And when she met lesbians in women's liberation, she thought, oh, that's a good idea. For her, the process felt organic and, for the most part, fun. As more and more women developed relationships with each other, Harriet Cohen, who had not yet been in a relationship with a woman, began to think, well, maybe there are just some people who are heterosexual and there are just some people who aren't. Soon, however, she slept with another woman and changed her mind. The women's movement gave you permission, she said. But she also wondered if she might have had sexual relationships with women earlier if she had had permission then, earlier. Playing guitar in the New Haven Women's Liberation Rock Band, Harriet would say to the audience, "People accuse us of hating men, being man-haters. Well, the next time somebody accuses you of being a man-hater, what you should do is," and then she opens her shirt to disclose her t-shirt saying, "Woman lover." I'm a woman lover, not a man-hater. In the heady atmosphere of women's liberation, Jennifer, Harriet, Sandy, and Rhea, and countless other women changed their sexual desires as a result of conscious decisions. But conscious choice did not make their lesbian relationships less erotic, or their same-sex desires less authentic. One of the crucial contributions of feminist thinking about sexuality was to challenge the mystification and silence that often made it difficult for women to experience or pursue sexual pleasure. Consciously changing one's sexual attractions was, for many women, part of this project. The lesbian experience of women's liberation activists in New Haven suggest alternative ways of thinking about lesbians apart from a dichotomy between authentic and political. It emphasizes instead the power of the women's liberation movement to enable women with a range of sexual experiences to reconfirm, reconfigure, and change their sexual desires. Unfortunately, today, virulently anti-queer movements use the idea of choice as a pretext to exact punitive measures against queer people, from death and imprisonment in Uganda and Nigeria to reparative therapy in the United States. So the gay rights movement has adopted the idea of sexual orientation being innate and it being impossible to change. So in this context, I'm saying that lesbianism was contagious in the 70s and that it was nurtured by the ideas and culture of women's liberation. Oy vey. I do believe that we need to reclaim this chapter of women's liberation, not only because it's an important part of their history, but also because it reminds us of the power of social movements to create and expand possibilities for our social and cultural lives. But I do also agree with Shane Phelan, who urges us to look at what's at stake in our differing stories. We must examine the consequences of our stories in terms of power and change. So I'm looking forward to talking with you all about these issues.
Anybody want to stretch? It's supposed to come up. You got it set up before, I know. Oh, okay. Let me put down the video light, take down some light. And,
So I can see the slides.
is that better? You see?
Yeah.
Okay. And, let's see, okay. Let me start some slides. Were any of you at the film the other night, two nights ago? There were some questions about woman-identified women. Which, we'll go to the slideshow. That would be better. Okay. And when I say dialectic, I mean in terms of one thing calling forth another, not that they synthesized. Woman-identified woman is definitely a revolutionary moment. Let me time myself here. in 1970 that, together with the Lavender Menace action, really launched the lesbian feminist movement. I mean, it was just kind of like ready to pop, and it did. And the impetus there was that there was this lesbian baiting that was going on. People felt we have to confront, quote, confront the lesbian issue. But, are you taping me?
Yes, I am.
Okay, you're not supposed to. I did not sign off on that.
Okay. I'll start recording.
Huh?
I'll start recording.
I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
I'll stop.
Oh, stop. You have stopped?
I will.
Thank you very much. Okay. Copyright, intellectual, anyway.